Okay, for this final section of this lecture series, I wanted to talk about free people of color. We talked about how difficult it was to attain freedom, but for those who were lucky enough to attain freedom, what were their experiences like? Um, During the colonial era, there are generally two phases. Um, First is the beginning of the colonial era before a dominant crop was established, like tobacco or rice. So before the rise of these um, of slavery in these different locales, you had free blacks who had greater privileges. Um, it was common for them to own land, to sign legal documents, to go to court against whites, and in some cases serve in the colonial militia, which is similar to an army. But after slavery became more entrenched, after it became more dominant and fixed and rooted in society, free blacks saw their lives become more and more oppressed. A series of laws appeared that limited their freedom. At this time, free blacks were restricted from testifying against whites, voting, serving on militias, etc. And a law that was consistently featured in almost every colony was a ban on interracial sexual relations. Um, Also, free blacks were always in danger because they could be sold into slavery at any time if they did not have their freedom papers on them. Um, Several of these circumstances affecting free blacks would change in later decades, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. One question that we may um, um, consider is that what was the relationship between free blacks and enslaved blacks? Um, was it um, contentious? Was it full of conflict? Was it separate? Was it distant? Um, or did free blacks and enslaved blacks form strong ties and bonds with one another based upon, even though they had different statuses of freedom? Um, so let's look into it. And really, the easy answer is that both things actually occurred. So, for example, or if you look at it from one side, in some instances, free blacks did distance themselves from enslaved blacks. One way was that they formed their own neighborhoods away from enslaved blacks. They married one another. Uh, Sometimes free blacks also formed their own organizations that if you wanted to join, you had to be free. However, the most telling example shows that free blacks did not always ally themselves with enslaved blacks. Is that you had some free blacks who enslaved other blacks in British North America. Now the um, now this was not common because most free blacks were so impoverished that they did not have enough money to own slaves themselves. Um, but some free blacks were just greedy, or yeah, some free blacks just had no qualms about enslaving blacks, or for them, they didn't consider themselves greedy. They said, "Well, this is how you rise in American society, um, and that's my desire to rise in American society, and it means nothing for me to enslave someone who belongs to the same racial group as I do." And it's a tricky question though, because we see a number of free blacks who quote unquote own enslaved blacks, but we do know in some of those instances they did not treat those enslaved blacks as slaves. So there were some colonies where it was against the law to um, set someone free. So if that was your mother, or if that was your significant other or your child, you would buy them. And in the records, it says that is your slave, but they just live like your mother or your significant other or your child. Um, so that happened in many instances when free blacks um, did quote unquote enslave other blacks, even though even that was uncommon. But there were, on the other side, free blacks formed close bonds with enslaved blacks. Um, and we know that because one of the clearest examples is that when enslaved blacks became free, oftentimes it was because they had a relationship with a free black who would help them escape, or they would help them uh, generate and raise the money that they needed to become free. And people just said, just because you're my mother or just because you're my brother and I'm free and you're not, I'm going to sever all relations with you. That concludes this lecture series.